That's fun.
Say something again, like testing.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Is that better?
Hello? How are your ears back there?
Can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Jean. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Meadow Barr, and I'm an outreach consultant to California Trout and the coordinator of the Water Talks program, which many of you have come to before. I am going to give an overview of the evening and then turn it over to Kara Baylog of the Shasta Valley RCD to introduce our program, who are sitting here in front of you. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the museum and Director Jean Nels for creating this really amazing space for us to be able to meet in. They recently received this grant to get the new floor and the screen and projector and PA system that makes it makes it really easy for community educational presentations and other things to happen. So thanks to the museum. Tonight our program runs from 6 to 8 p.m. There are no breaks, so if you need to use the restroom as you came in, there are 2 restrooms at the beginning. And also there's some snacks for you if you need to boost your blood sugar level, then please help yourself. Just be quiet going about taking care of your needs. If you have one of these or another noise-making device, if you could please silence that right now, that'd be great. And tonight the program will run through and we'll take questions at the end. So at the table where the gentlemen are standing around, the Forest Service has provided some comment cards. So if you want to have that to jot down questions on, or if you have a notebook to jot down your questions, they're just going to run through their entire presentation before we take questions. And I believe that those are all the logistics. And then just to say that it's really nice, I'm excited tonight that the Water Talks program is joined with the Forest Stewardship Series program to present the Forest Service's Mount Shasta Watershed Analysis. As you'll hear during the presentation, this is one of the things the Forest Service does that is purely information gathering. It's not a decision-making document, and it's a living document. So it's all information that's really important to all of us here tonight for us to listen to and learn from. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kara of the Shasta Valley RCD. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Meadow. Once again, I'm Kara Baylog. I'm the Watershed Coordinator with the Shasta Valley RCD. In addition to other duties, I run our Rainbow Ridge Forest Stewardship Workshop Series. I see some familiar faces who go to that series, and obviously I assume a lot of you people have gone to the Water Talks as well. This was really a good chance for Water Talks and Forest Stewardship Series to come together and co-host this. It's just really great that we can have a partner in this like Cal Trout and then the Forest Service as well, so we really appreciate that opportunity. The Watershed Analysis really brings together so many different aspects of ecological management and health of the ecosystem that both of us really felt like it wasn't just the sole jurisdiction of one of our educational series. It's really applicable to both of them. And when we look at the environment from a watershed level and the care for all the aspects of its ecosystem and its resources, we have to look at things from recreation to wildlife, from economic opportunities to viewshed. And we can't help but acknowledge the extreme importance of both an ample and protected, high-quality source of water, as well as healthy forests. So my hope for you tonight is that not only will you be able to learn a little bit more about the Mount Shasta watersheds, thanks to the Forest Service, but also that we'll start to understand the questions that we should be asking on a watershed scale. How do we effectively manage these ecosystems on both private and public forest lands? What can we learn from the watershed analysis with the Forest Service and bring to our own forests closer to home? So with that in mind, let's listen to this watershed analysis and be thinking both about the Mount Shasta watersheds and the surrounding watersheds, including that on Rainbow Ridge. I'm just going to quickly go over who's presenting for us tonight. We have 4 presenters from the U.S. Forest Service. First, we've got Carolyn Napper, who's the district ranger, and she's been here for a little over a year and a half. She was previously at the San Dimas Technology Center in Lassen and the Stanislaus, so she's been all around. We've got Steve Bachman, who's been with the U.S. Forest Service for about 18 years. Previously, he's been with the USGS as well, the U.S. Geologic Survey, also as a hydrologist. We have Stacy Smith, the Land Special Use Officer, and she's been with the Forest Service a whole 25 years, so veteran. Previously, she also was a forester with the U.S. Forest Service. And then we have Jennifer Redmond, who is the special use, recreational special use officer, and she's been with the Forest Service for about 2 years, previously working as an earth and life science teacher. So if you could all give your undivided attention, I'm going to invite Carolyn Napper up here, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Kara. Well, tonight, as Meadow and Kara were explaining, we wanted to share our Mount Shasta watershed analysis with all of you. We started this work about this time last year. We had an interdisciplinary team, so we just have, there are 4 of us tonight, but there were probably about 10 or 12 of us working on the document to begin with. And really what we were trying to do is work off of existing information. We didn't do any surveys, but it was really amazing. It was a really good experience in terms of how much we all learned about the watershed analysis area. And so we don't think we have all the information. We know we don't. So we wanted to share it with folks like yourselves so that if you had some ideas, suggestions, additional information, we could incorporate that because as Meadow said, it's a living document. So what we're hoping with this meeting is that we could introduce the Mount Shasta watershed analysis process, explain how we gather the information, and also solicit that feedback and input. And maybe you'll be familiar with the triangle to your right is showing that a lot of times we'll do things on the left-hand side, like plan to project. So we're just gathering information so we can make a better, more informed project proposal. And then you'll often hear, like when we go for designing a campground or a timber sale, we'll move into the NEPA analysis. But this analysis is strictly on the left-hand side, what we call, and it's just gathering information, helping us understand the area. So what the watershed analysis does, it helps provide managers with an understanding of the ecological processes and interactions. We're looking at how past and present activities and events interact with the physical, biological, and social environments. And then what the watershed analysis does not do is we're not making a decision on anything. We have identified some areas where maybe we do additional work, but there is no decision associated with this. So the analysis goals, we're going to identify and review key resource areas, and that's what I said, you know, in terms of we had archaeologists, geologists, silviculturists, fire folks. They helped collect and organize the existing information about each key issue. And then we identified what were some of the resource information gaps. Because as I said, we know we don't have all the information. But once we identify some of these gaps, then we can be more strategic in terms of obtaining that information. We also pose key questions about the specific resource conditions. And then what was really kind of fun is getting down to the bottom is describing potential opportunities. So this is posted on our website, but what we're going to do is go through it. There's 6 chapters in a watershed analysis. And the first we're going to start with just some examples of how we characterize the watershed. Then we'll go into identifying some of the key issues and questions. And then Chapter 3 talks about describing the current conditions in the watershed. So what's out there now? Chapter 4, we try to look back at the reference condition. And this one's always tricky because what we try to do is find information and data about how the area used to look and feel. And so we do have some good information, but that's something where maybe many of you could help us, some of that. Chapter 5 We then kind of interpret the differences between the change condition from reference to the current condition. And then 6 is identifying the opportunities. So what we're going to do now is go through each of those chapters with a couple of examples. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
And I want to thank you all for coming. And as I look out at this crowd, I notice there's a tremendous amount of expertise in this room. And I do think a lot of people in the audience here have the potential to contribute to this analysis. So if you have a chance to fill out the comment cards or even just talk to us afterwards, that would be most welcome. So chapter 1 really is just the watershed characterization. This is our way of introducing the watershed and just kind of rolling out and just describing it real basically with a few key facts. And this is your first view of the Mount Shasta watershed. And you notice it's a very, very large area. It's composed of roughly 201,000 acres, and that's roughly equivalent to 314 square miles of ground. It also has roughly 44% of the area close to private lands. And this area is an area that we take a look at for the next how activities on private lands affect Forest Service management. Roughly 9% of the area is composed of tree plantations as well. And then roughly 40,000 acres, or 18% of the watershed, is within the wilderness area, which of course brings the summit of the mountain. So this analysis area is a little unusual in the fact that we're talking a lot about watershed analysis, but this is really a watershed. I mean, if you look at this map, most watersheds are unique in that they have a drainage area where if a drop of rain falls anywhere in the watershed, it's going to come out of a single outlet. Mount Shasta is really a watershed in reverse. If a drop of rain falls near the summit of Mount Shasta, it could just as easily end up in the Klamath River up in Northern California as it could in the Sacramento River and the Bay Delta. So this really is 2 major drainage basins. So why did we choose this area for our analysis? The answer is that we actually have roughly 7 different watersheds that summit on the top of Mount Shasta. And the Forest Service has already analyzed the lower reaches of all of those watersheds. So when we did these earlier analyses, we kept asking ourselves, we really want to analyze one piece of the pie up on the summit of Mount Shasta and do it 7 times in a row. And the answer was no, so it just made a lot more sense to combine all of those 7 pieces, 7 upper watersheds, into one larger ecosystem analysis. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little about the geology of the watershed. First of all, as everybody well knows, Mount Shasta is a volcano. This is something we don't get to talk about very often. It's a composite or stratovolcano, which is composed of lava flows interlayered with tephra and other pyroclastic material. This slide shows the different types of rocks that are commonly found on Mount Shasta. One of the things that watershed analyses are supposed to do is always force us to look out at larger contexts. In this case, from a geologic setting perspective, the larger context for Mount Shasta would be the Pacific Ring of Fire, or the entire Cascade volcano chain and everything else. And the Ring of Fire is a chain of volcanoes that encircles the entire Pacific Ocean, and the ring contains roughly 75% of the world's active volcanoes. So yes, we all live at the base of a volcano, but the good news is this volcano is currently dormant. Shasta, on average, has erupted at least once every 250 to 300 years. And then recent work by the U.S. Geological Survey actually suggests that the eruption activity may have even been more frequent. Mount Shasta was probably active in 1786 based on observations from ships on the Pacific, and it may have erupted as recently as 1855 as well. The USGS has completed extensive surveys on the risks and hazards associated with Mount Shasta. And here we're looking at 2 slides that were created by Mr. Dan Miller in 1980 in his risk hazard publication, showing the risk of pyroclastic and eruptive debris flows on Mount Shasta on the left, and then lava flows on the right. The pyroclastic flows are the ones that always intimidate me the most. They basically consist of mixtures of hot gases, rock and ash that can travel rapidly down the flank of the volcano at speeds of up to 100 miles per hour. And they're also unique in that they behave more like a fluid, and they can actually flow up and over topography as well. Unlike their counterparts, the eruptive debris flows, which are composed of liquid slurries of rock, mud, ash, and water, which usually tend to stay on alluvial fans or the channel beds themselves. So this paints a pretty grim picture in some ways when you look at the disturbance potential. You'll notice as big as our ecosystem analysis area is, the hazard zones extend well through it, actually enveloping it extend outside of the watershed as well. So rather than close with that thought, I thought I would look at, again, one of the larger contexts here, which is that all these processes, while very disruptive to the natural world when they occur, actually do provide us with a lot of benefits that are associated with volcanoes, particularly in the Cascade chain. One of those is one of the reasons we're all here, which is they produce this incredible volcano with high quality recreation, scenic values, and that is just a jewel for Mount Shasta area. Number two would be the productive soils. Mount Shasta and the surrounding slopes and forests contain some of the most productive soils in the world. That would only occur and only be created by very frequent volcanic activity and the continuous movement and deposition of new soil out on those alluvial fans. And lastly, Mount Shasta also, of course, produces very high-quality water from its spring discharges. So while we take the good with the bad here in Cascade volcanoes and all these processes bring a lot of positive results as well. So one of the purposes of watershed analysis, and also for the Forest Service, is you have a bunch of specialists, and they're very good at what they do, maybe with respect to hydrology, geology, wildlife. But this process is designed to kind of force all of us to step out of our boxes and look at the way that our discipline, maybe geology, affects wildlife or vice versa. And here's just one example of that. If you look at other riparian areas throughout the Cascades, such as Mount Rainier or Mount Lassen, generally speaking, you'll find a lot more in the way of wet meadows and more extensive meadow systems at higher elevations than you'll find on Mount Shasta. This is a picture of one of the smaller meadows, but not too atypical a meadow up in Mount Shasta. This is Hummingbird Meadows. And you'll see that it barely is a meadow. It's really a swale up in a talus field that happens to have a spring in it where we have the ability to basically get a little bit of a foothold for soil and vegetation and create this nice system. So why don't we have more of these? I mean, I was kind of scratching my head when I first moved here, and the USGS in one of their earlier publications does provide one possible explanation for that, and that is that Mount Shasta has just been extremely active. The disturbance processes have been so frequent that these areas just don't have time to develop. So when we look at a meadow like Hummingbird, it could be potentially very, very young, maybe hundreds of years old. And at given time, you would expect something like this to probably develop into something much larger. And similarly, you expect other meadows, such as panther meadows, to possibly develop into larger meadows, provided they aren't interrupted again by another large disturbance process. Okay, I'm going to turn it over. We'll be bouncing off a number of people here as they talk about their different resource areas, but we're going to move over to the vegetation section.
Yeah, so this is just trying to get back to, again, further characterization of the watershed. So what was really important was that we come up with a common understanding of the vegetation that's out there. And, if you're a lumper or a splitter, you'll come up with a different vegetation typing. But these are some of the main categories where we see in the watershed analysis area. The red fir up near the top, of course, the white where it's all rock, then the red fir surrounding that, and then dropping down to white fir, mixed conifer. And the reason why this is important is because that affects not only the vegetation, we look at insect mortality, we also are concerned about fires. So everything responds a little bit differently in these areas. And when we go to looking at reference conditions, we're going to be looking at, well, how have we changed this environment over time? So this is what we have now as our dominant vegetation types. We also tried to look at how does wildlife use the area? And we wanted to recognize that wildlife is moving in and out of the watershed analysis area. So this is important because we don't want to limit the area to a certain scale. It has to be responsive to what you're studying. So in this case, we wanted to identify that deer are moving in and out, and so they're going to be using some of the vegetation in the watershed area at certain times of the year. So that will help us in terms of our management and some of the opportunities that we might be able to develop. So now we're going to go to chapter 2, and Jen's going to explain that.
So
So now we transitioned from chapter 1 where we were summarizing as a whole what the watershed characterization was, and now we've moved into chapter 2, which is the issues and key questions. So in this watershed analysis, we identified some key resource issues that we were able to focus on in our analysis. So these issues will be different from watershed to watershed. For instance, in the Mount Shasta watershed, natural disturbance regimens and public use management play a key role in this analysis, in this watershed. In other watersheds in the area, they might not play as huge of a role. So we developed some key questions that go along with each of the issues. I'm only going to cover 2 of the topics since we don't have time to cover all of the issues that we went over. So for public use management, we developed some questions such as where does concentrated recreation use occur, and how does that affect unique habitats, as well as cultural resources, the local economy, private owners and property. Where do activities conflict with one another or conflict with current management directions? What other public uses are there, and what are the implications of these uses? What tools do we have to improve recreation management on Mount Shasta? What about traditional cultural uses? Which legal designations influence opportunities or constraints, such as ownership, the forest plan, cultural sites that are up on the mountain, water rights, and threatened and endangered habitat? So a lot of you might be able to relate to some of these key questions that we've highlighted. And throughout the document, we try to answer these questions. So the natural disturbance regimen key questions that we covered. So what are the dominant natural resources within the watershed? How do they interact with forest management activities? So this, for example, roads, those might be affected by some disturbances. Are there specific locations in the watershed where concentrated human use and infrastructure are located in areas of high geologic hazards? So what opportunities exist to redesign or manage the constructed infrastructure, as well as future modifications and additions such as roads, campgrounds, and facilities to facilitate future management and be compatible with natural disturbance processes? And what effects does this have on public health and safety? So as we continue through this talk, focus in on some of these questions we've highlighted. We're going to cover a lot of those issues and questions. So now we're moving to chapter 3.
So chapter 3 is usually the bulk of the document. Usually when you see a watershed analysis on a shelf of the Forest Service, about 50% of the document is composed of the information in chapter 3. It seems that's the place where people have the most to say, because we know a lot about current conditions for resources on our watersheds. I'm going to focus in again on one of the core topics that the analysis is supposed to look at, which is erosion processes. And I've already talked about some of the big ticket ones, like volcanically triggered erosion processes. But I'm going to look at some of the more common ones that are also fairly large scale on Shasta, and those would be non-eruptive debris flows. As you can see, erosion processes are very active on Mount Shasta. Just looking at this image, it almost looks like somebody dropped like an ice cream cone on a sidewalk and it's just melting away. And it's because the material at the upper end of the watershed is constantly eroding, and it's being deposited on these alluvial fans that ring the base of the mountain. This slide shows the non-eruptive debris flow hazard associated with Shasta. You'll notice that debris flows are common on all flanks, really, on the mountain, but the Mount Shasta city side. At least in this particular slide. You'll notice that the debris flows also align closely with some of the named channels. So if we started at the very top there, we have Whitney Creek on the north side of the mountain, moving clockwise over to Gravel Creek, Ash Creek, Mud Creek, and then Diller Canyon over on the Shastina side of the mountain. So erosion processes are usually most active on Mount Shasta following droughty or very warm winters. And this seems counterintuitive at first, but what's happening here is that after a very, very wet, snowy winter, Mount Shasta is left with a blanket of snow. And this snow really does act like a blanket, or almost like you can think of it as a glue that just buffers the mountain and protects it from erosion. So when we have a summer storm on a wet winter, the rain will fall on the snow and just soak in, and usually you won't see a lot of debris flow activity. Conversely, after a drought year, when Mount Shasta's slopes are laid bare, the glacial ice is exposed to the sun, that's when you really see most of the big debris flow events occurring. Looking at two different debris flows that have occurred just since I've been working here, two very different scales. This is Diller Canyon. They actually the canyon experienced a debris flow in 1997, the same year that Highway 97 was buried by Whitney Creek, roughly half a mile under a debris flow. You can kind of see on the left here the freshly cut inner gorge. The debris flows move a tremendous amount of material when they do occur down the channel in the high gradient reaches and then deposit this material on the fans. The photo on the right is a very different event. This was a summer storm that occurred in 2003, just a small little convective storm that focused itself over the east slopes of Mount Shasta and caused debris flows in all of the east side streams like Gravel Creek and Brewer Creek, Ash Creek, and Mud Creek. And this employee here is actually standing in a gully, just a freshly cut, you can think of it as a slice of a hill slope where water left one of the channels and just flowed straight down the mountain. So you can see the scour power that these events can have. And even just a small summer storm is capable of moving just a tremendous amount of material down the mountain. So again, trying to step out of the hydrologist in my hydrology box, I'm looking at some of the relationships between debris flows and other resource areas. Why we don't have fish. It's common knowledge that you don't see a lot of fish in streams on Mount Shasta. In fact, you don't see a lot of water. But one of the reasons we don't is because of the very frequent disturbance regimes on Mount Shasta. This is Brewer Creek following the 2003 summer storm. Whenever it rains in the summer and we have significant precipitation, these streams always act up. They always flow turbid, with the exception of the very small spring-fed systems. The debris flows can also wreak havoc on our transportation system, as debris flows are basically, when they send material downstream, they deposit on alluvial fans. And debris flow channels aren't meant to stay in one place. They're meant to just meander back and forth on the fan. So you can think of these channels as building this deposit over hundreds of years, hundreds of feet deep, as the flow moves back and forth. So this is really bad news for road systems that have been designed and built adjacent to debris flow channels on alluvial fans. And oftentimes you'll end up with situations like this. I'm not even sure exactly what year this photo was taken, but here we have a channel that has done something what we call pirated the road, or the road has pirated the channel, either way you want to look at it. But it has intercepted the flow of the runoff from a stream. If the road is slightly through-cut, it runs up and down the mountain. If it's just a little bit in size, it can become the channel in the future. So moving a little bit of foreshadowing, we think are ways we can address some of these problems now that we're becoming aware of how frequent these disturbances are. And then this is kind of an interesting example of how even debris flows occurring high up on Mount Shasta can really influence a lot of other resources, including wildlife habitat. This is Ash Creek, Upper Ash Creek, and several years back we had a summer thunderstorm once again, and following a dry winter. There was no snow up high on the mountain. And you can see that it caused a small debris flow, not a very big one, but well up in the headwaters, which is just below the glacier. And what happened during this flow is the flow of Ash Creek actually split several times. So it formed several braided channels. In some cases, the flow braided and came back together. In other cases, it just kind of braided and flowed off onto a fan somewhere else and infiltrated into the ground. So this had a tremendous effect on lower Ash Creek, which is one of the only perennial channels and one of the only water sources in late summer to the McLeod Flats. Because the flow split up high, not enough water was available for the channel, and we basically dewatered roughly 4 miles of channel on the Ash Creek alluvial fan. So a stream that had never been observed to go dry, at least since I've been here, went completely dry for a summer. And luckily, this situation reversed itself. The channel reorganized. The flows did return, but it took a year for that to happen. So again, just a nexus between how habitat and water availability for wildlife can be affected by something very high up on the mountain. And I might add that this whole process can actually occur in reverse. You can have a debris torrent high up on the mountain that actually consolidates a flow that maybe was spreading out in many different directions. And I think that's what we may have seen with Cascade Gulch this last summer, which was observed to actually flow for the first time in decades all the way down to Mount Shasta High School. So there is one more type of erosion process that's associated not with soil. We had to find a place to put this, and it seemed like a good spot. We want to talk just for a little bit about historic snow avalanches on Mount Shasta. This slide here shows existing avalanches that were mapped that occurred between 1993 and 2010 in the lighter blue color. And then it also shows historical snow avalanche runout zones where avalanches are likely, but we haven't seen them in quite some time. We've been slowly but surely compiling information on avalanche hazard on Mount Shasta. And this watershed analysis is the first time that we've actually put it all together in one setting like this. So why is this important? Again, the obvious nexus is for any of you that do a lot of backcountry skiing or snowmobiling or snowshoeing. These avalanches just happen to be occurring in the areas that we like to visit in the wintertime and recreate in. We're looking here primarily at Avalanche Gulch in the old ski bowl. And so we have a tremendous overlap and potential for impacts to human health and safety. So the Forest Service is hoping to increase our knowledge and understanding, work with our partners, and to basically continue to learn how avalanches have the potential to affect the mountain and where these effects are likely to occur. Again, just some related topics. The avalanches can also affect access. This is an avalanche that occurred just below Panther Meadows. Many of you might remember this back in 1995. It affected Everett just in the fact that it closed off access, but it also had tremendous effects on kind of resetting the vegetation seral stage. Here we have basically a fairly old-growth redwood forest that was virtually wiped off the map by this avalanche. And so avalanches are really important agents to change the vegetation on Mount Shasta as well. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the hydrology of Mount Shasta, just from the perspective of runoff. This is just a conceptualized idea of what happens when water falls on Shasta. Precipitation comes as rain and snow. It usually hangs out on the mountain for a period of several months to hundreds of years, depending on whether it becomes part of a glacier or not. But when it does melt, virtually all of this water soaks into the ground. That's why groundwater here is in the large pond. A very small percentage of the water will actually run off the mountain in surface flow, but that is extremely small. Even your small springs that you see high on the mountain usually don't make it down the mountain to a perennial river. The only two streams that do that are Mud Creek and Squaw Valley Creek on the south side of the mountain. And then, of course, the groundwater is held in the mountain for any period of time ranging from 1 to 50 years, where it is eventually released in springs that surround the lower flanks of the mountain. So again, I can't say enough about just how strong this groundwater influence is. This is a picture I took of my son several years back at Bunny Flat, standing by this tree with a no snowmobile sign, and there he is by the same tree several months later with a sign easily 20 feet over his head. It amazes me that you can have that much snow, and you think about it, that snow's everywhere at that elevation on the mountain, and yet you won't find one channel. It just all soaks into the ground. 2006 was a little unusual with respect to the volume, but once again, we did not see any runoff during that spring melt other than what came off the parking lot. And again, another testimony to the strong groundwater influence. This is Ash Creek at its confluence with the McCloud River. Ash Creek drains a watershed area roughly 194 square miles. So it is a very wet watershed. It receives a lot of rainfall, it's subject to rain and snow events, and yet this creek hasn't been observed to flow since 2006. When it did, it was just a trickle. So even during the big winter storms, you barely see any runoff off that McCloud side of Mount Shasta. It will happen. It did happen in the 97 flood, but that was a very unusual event. And lastly, I'm just going to talk, because I had one slide to talk about water quality. And one of the things that watershed analysis is also supposed to do is look at the range of variability in different parameters. So in this case, water quality. And you'll notice that Mount Shasta really covers a wide gauntlet in terms of what its water looks like and how good it is. The McCloud River on the lower left is fed by Big Springs, which dumps roughly 600 CFS of spring flow into the McCloud of just very high quality water. Conversely, our surface channels, once again, don't seem to do as well. That's Mud Creek on the right. Not that unusual for a typical hot summer day. Mud Creek just runs very turbid, again due to the fact that it has just tremendous amount of erosion occurring in its upper canyon. So two very different systems, but both completely natural. Okay, I'm going to shift gears again to vegetation.
So these next couple slides have pictures that represent some of the vegetation concerns we have in the watershed. So down here on your left is a picture depicting the dense shrub condition that can be seen throughout the watershed. In the center we've got conifer encroachment. This picture is depicting on the north side of Mount Shasta where we have an aspen stand where the conifer's encroaching into that aspen stand. A big concern in that area we have is with the black oak stands where the conifers are encroaching in those stands, more so than what we've been seeing with the aspen. In the lower right-hand corner, we have a picture of a ponderosa stand on the south side of Mount Shasta, where it is infected with bug kill and disease. So that's a concern in the watershed. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of one of our plantations, and as you can see, we have same species, same age group plantations, so that can be an issue, going back to the bug and disease infestations. If you have a stand that's all same age, same species, it's easier to bounce from one tree to the next. On the upper right-hand corner, we have a picture of the fuel loading. This one's due to an avalanche. I believe this photo's from the infamous alien footprint that can be seen on the west side of Mount Shasta. So as you can see, that's a lot of fuel that's dead and down that could be of concern.
So fire is another key element in the watershed, and this is a great diagram showing our fire history inside the watershed dating back to about 1917. The red is lightning-caused fires, and the yellow is other. Lightning is typically the most common fire starter, but you may not be surprised to learn that in our watershed here, it is human-caused. And you may also notice that a lot of those clumps of yellow occur around our communities. They occur around our very popular access routes, like the Memorial Highway here on the bottom, and they occur around our transportation and utility corridors, railroad, highway, and our power line corridors. So interesting map. The other thing that's interesting about the watershed here is the large tan areas are our large fire history, and they're pretty significantly clumped up in that northern area where, if we remember our vegetation map, that would be our shrub area in that region. And also the north side of the mountain where we have a lot of wind-driven fires. Climate on the north side is really significantly different than on the south side. Fire in the watershed, as far as current condition, one of the things we're also looking at now is the wildland-urban interface. And there is a lot of wildland-urban interface in the Mount Shasta watershed. So 67% of this watershed is actually in designated wildland-urban interface areas. A high amount. So human use, I gotta say, I don't get involved in watershed analysis very much because generally there aren't that many humans in watershed analysis documents. But by goodness, in this one we have got a lot of humans, and you'll be happy to know we're currently in the Mount Shasta watershed tonight, so we're all inside. There are 5 towns inside the watershed. As we said earlier, there's 40%, 44% of the watershed is private property, which is pretty unusual, even with our ownership pattern. There's several municipal water systems. The town of Weed, the town of Mount Shasta, the town of McLeod all draw their municipal water systems from within the watershed, spring-fed. There's commercial water uses. We know about water bottling plants, and those that are here and those that have been proposed. There's also a lot of development. We've got ski areas, we've got golf courses, we've got electronic sites, we've got railroads, utilities, we've got super easy access into this watershed. We've got 3 major all-season highways that border our watershed. Now, that said, with all of that fabulous access, and here we are, a great photo of the hill climbing happening here, we've got a lot of recreation use that goes on here as well. There's pretty popular local use, there's very popular national use, and we also have international use, which is a problem only in that you may notice there's also very few developed resources to accommodate all those people. The other thing that's a little unique about this watershed is the pretty dense road system, almost 900 miles of road. And that comes with its own challenges as well. So human use is a big piece of this one. And oh my goodness, there they are. This is a picture of our favorite bunny flat on a lovely, warm, sunny spring day. And you and all of your friends are recreating here. You'll notice cars are parked as far as you can see down the road. The chart on the right-hand side is 2007 to 2012. This is actually data from the traffic counter that is on the Everett Memorial Highway. And if you use an average of roughly 3 to 3.5 people per car, that puts you at nearly 100,000 people a year that are traveling up that highway, which is a whole bunch. That right there is the one toilet facility. Yeah. So impressive, actually, limited amount of development. Also, the other thing that's interesting about this site is, especially in spring, this is a pretty mixed use pattern. So this is folks coming up to backcountry ski, to snowshoe, to snowplay, to snowmobile, and a whole lot of people that are just driving to the end of the road to see the very beautiful snow-covered Mount Shasta. So a pretty cramped space with a lot of different kind of uses all taking off in this spot. This is another little look with a piece of data at kind of what our use is. So the top is summit passes. These are the folks that are going to go over 10,000 feet inside the wilderness area. Averages about 6,000 folks a year. We get a peak of about 9,000 back in, looks like 2001. The bottom, this is wilderness passes. And the purple line, as you may suspect, is, again, that previous picture. That is Everett Memorial Highway and the trailheads that take off of that route. Averages maybe 15,000 here with a peak, well, maybe close to 30,000. So that we can assume is our wilderness use. And if we kind of look at that as 15 to 30,000 people, what that says to me is there's 70,000 people that aren't going here. So they're traveling up that road and they're going non into the wilderness. So where are they going? Well, one of the places we know they're going, based on just ground evidence, is into some of our really lovely wet meadow systems. And some of the popular ones here are, of course, Panta Meadows, which gets a huge amount of use during the summer months in spring, and into Southgate Meadows. A lot of folks are traveling up into the ski bowl area, traveling into that drainage itself, and of course a lot of folks are also going up into our neighbor, the Sierra Club Foundation, to hike up to the hut. So a lot of use and questionably great facilities to accommodate all that use. So over time, some of the impacts we're going to see is compaction in the soil, especially in some of these wet meadow systems. Very concentrated use in really small areas, as Steve was talking about. A lot of these meadow systems are pretty tiny for 100,000 people who all join hands and sing Kumbaya. Devegetation, that clearly occurs when you get these duplicate trail systems. And from a public management standpoint, also user conflicts. Throughout seasons, when you get that many people up into small areas, all trying to do very different things, a lot of conflicting opinions about what the appropriate use should be up there. The other place they go into dry meadow systems. And of course, on the left here, this is sand flat, looking very lovely with flowers blooming, and red fir flat looking very unlovely with a very dusty dirt covered surface. Sand flat, red fir flat, jack flat area of the mountain is flat and pretty easily drivable. So what we see happening there is very limited developed campgrounds along that memorial corridor. So dispersed camping happens in a lot of these locations, and we are a nation that likes to drive, and if we can drive there, we will. So a lot of braided road systems out into the sandflower area, maybe not the best arrangement to continue to have fabulous flowers on these deep, sandy, and fairly dry soils. So that is a concern. And then we're going to move to Chapter 4, which are our reference conditions. So this is a little bit of a look back in time. And I think I'm handing it over to Steve.
So, yeah, chapter 4 of the document is a bit shorter most of the time because usually the Forest Service doesn't have a tremendous amount of information on reference conditions. But the real purpose of this chapter is to look back on some of the historic disturbance events, historic land use activities, to determine what were the biggest causal agents of change over time. And then hopefully get some idea maybe of what this area was like prior to European settlement. Difficult to do. I decided just to illustrate what we would include in reference conditions for geology and hydrology, just using two examples. And the first one here is the 1924 debris flow event in Mud Creek. This debris flow started in the summer of '24 when a large chunk of the Kanawha Glacier capped off its mooring and just slipped down into the Mud Creek Inner Gorge, where it came to rest at the bottom and then just proceeded to melt very rapidly for a period of roughly several years, spawning a series of debris flows over that time. The debris flow was very large in '24, and it basically buried square miles of the McLeod Flats east of McLeod under roughly 10 to 13 feet of material. It also was so pervasive that back then, of course, Shasta Lake wasn't there and McLeod Reservoir wasn't there. It actually turned and discolored the water of the San Francisco Bay for a short period of time during that year. So again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This young lady from McLeod is standing by a telegraph line that, as the photo shows, is roughly 18 feet above the ground when it was put in. However, she's about 5 feet tall. And so you can infer that roughly 13 feet of new material was deposited in this location. And then kind of looking over to the photo to the right, you just envision this occurring over an entire landscape. And it really is a testimony, once again, to the tremendous amount of erosion. And it, basically this gives us an idea of what we might, again, see in the future with Mud Creek, which supposedly has roughly a 75-year recurrence interval for debris flow events and activities. So another thing that you can do in Chapter 4 is you can look back in time, and if you have the information, you can get an idea as to the frequency that these types of events occur. Here are a couple selected creeks that do experience debris flows, and once again, this information comes courtesy of the U.S. Geological Survey, that has done a lot of dating of debris flow activity on Mount Shasta over the past 20 years or so. And you'll notice right away that debris flows really aren't that uncommon. These are all large debris flows. Windy Creek has been very busy. Bowling Creek next to Windy Creek also has been busy. And then Ash Creek, I don't know if many people would remember back, but it had a very large debris flow as well in 1977. So once again, you can use the reference conditions chapter with information like this to provide some sort of forecast for where we might see activity in the future. And I wouldn't be able to leave this talk without just touching briefly on Mount Shasta's glaciers. Another good example of how you can compare reference conditions to current conditions to look at trends over time. It's fairly common knowledge based on recent scientific literature that Mount Shasta's glaciers are actually bucking a trend worldwide, and they're actually growing. And of course, the way they know that is researchers from, I believe, the University of Santa Cruz did a lot of studies about maybe 10 years ago now, and they compared photos from the 30s to recent imagery of the mountain to determine that these glaciers were indeed growing. And here's a good example, looking at the Hollow Glacier here. However, watershed analyses are living documents, and Just last week, I received an email from a researcher from Portland State who has just gone out in weeks, taken a lot of photo points of the glaciers that were shot by Mr. Rhodes, was his name, several decades back. And his data is showing that it's a little more complicated than we once believed. And it doesn't appear that all the glaciers on Mount Shasta are actually growing. Some of them are, but the changes are much more complex. Some of them appear to have widened and are taking up more space, but have decreased in elevation and height. And this is just very early information that's coming out of the study. But I guess I use that as an example to illustrate that's why we like these, keep these watershed analyses living documents. They're not decisional documents, and we can just roll in new scientific information as it becomes available. Lastly, just another illustration of how things change over time. Stacy talked about Panther Meadows and the impacts. I was really surprised when we did this analysis, watershed analysis, how recently a lot of the activity in Panther Meadows had occurred. Looking at the slide on the right, that's the spring, Panther Meadows spring in 1967, looking pretty healthy. And then the spring in 1994, looking quite different. It had been denuded just due to a lot of use. It also appears to have dewatered due to possibly the creation of trail systems throughout the meadows that tend to shunt water away and move surface flows to other areas rather than keep them infiltrating in the ground in the meadow. So what was the causal agent for this change? Of course it was people, but one of the things we realized when we did the analysis is what really triggered this use was the improvement and completion of Everett Memorial Highway for the ski bowl. And before that, and looking at even in the 60s, I would have thought there would have been a ton of people up there. But really, the use didn't really pick up until the Everett was really improved in the latter, just of the relatively recent past. And you can speculate that prior to the 70s, it appears that things really weren't that impacted up there over time.
So humans have been known to impact changes in vegetation, and in this watershed, we have changes due to plantations, fire suppression, logging, and so the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk briefly about the plantations we've got. So we have approximately 19,000 acres of plantations within this watershed. About 54% of those plantations are considered early seral, and about 46% are in the mid-seral stage. So ponderosa pine is the typical tree species that you see in these plantations. The early seral stage of these plantations, there's not a whole lot of brush that's found. In more the mid-seral stages, you see a lot more brush in the understory. So historically, in these pictures that were taken in the 1960s, you can see that historically we had brush fields, and we're not sure, and we're hoping, people might have more information of what the vegetation looked like before the 1960s, before the railroad was here and logging occurred. So as far as we know, on the west side of Mount Shasta, it was mainly brush fields. So the picture on your right-hand side is showing some windrows that we came in and used tractors to push the topsoil and those brushes in these windrows, and then we came back and burned that material and then planted trees, typically ponderosa, in between those windrows. So that might explain if you've seen some of these sand piles out in the plantations. So one thing that might be of concern here, we've pushed a lot of that topsoil up, so it has affected the plantations and their growth rates. They're doing relatively pretty well on the western and southern parts of Mount Shasta. On the northern parts, the plantations aren't doing as well, and that can be due to the high winds that we see on the northern parts, as well as lower precipitation. And we have a lot of the shrubland coming back. So typically we try to maintain and manage that shrub encroachment in the plantations by using mechanical treatment, as you can see in the picture to the right. So One concern, as we talked about in the earlier slides, in I believe it's chapter 1, we might have some concerns, or chapter 3, of these monotypic nature of plantations being at risk for disease or bug kill. So
Native Americans, also part of our reference condition here in the Mount Shasta area. There is evidence dating back over 5,000 years of Native American occupancy in the area. The map diagram we're looking at is Southern Oregon, Northern California, showing some of the tribes that were mapped here locally. The 4 tribes that we primarily have as far as watershed occupancy are the Shasta, Wintu, Achimawi, also known as Pit River tribe, and let's see, what am I? And the Modoc, sorry. The mountain figured pretty prominently in traditional and mythological stories of not only the tribes here very locally within the watershed, but also tribes who could see the mountain. The Karuk is a great example. And although we talk about the Native American use here as our reference condition, it's very important to remember that they are also part of our current conditions, and that these 4 local tribes still conduct traditional ceremonies within the watershed annually right now. So at some point, Native American use transitions a bit to European use, and we start to have some small settlements moving into the area in the 1800s. Railroads. So this is one of my favorite topics. I don't know if you've ever seen a map of the Shasta National Forest, but the ownership pattern here will keep people like me and lands busy for an entire career. 1866, important, that is the railroad land grants. And at that time, the United States government granted to the railroads 10 miles on either side, 1 square mile sections alternating, and in some areas it extended for up to 30 miles. So ownership was generated as a headache right then. Interesting thing about railroads, however, is basically when 1866, 1886, 20 years later, construction reaches our area and the line starts to go from Edgewood to running to Edgewood in 1887. So it passes through the watershed at that point. Now, something to know about railroads is they gobble up timber. So they arrived and quickly started cutting trees for ties, bridges, trestles, tunnels, stations, and then continued to need wood for fuel for steam engines. Railroads were a pretty big impact when we talk about vegetation in the watershed, specifically in the areas on the western border and on the northern border where those tracks still currently are. It is interesting to note that in 1896, the Dunsmuir News reported that when Sierra Pacific, or Southern Pacific, built through to Oregon, there was a splendid body of sugar pine timber extending from a couple miles north of Dunsmuir to Blackview Summit. That timber has all been cut out. And by 1899 was the work by Hart Merriam, and we have used that document quite a bit in this watershed analysis as part of our reference condition for vegetation. What's interesting to note, however, is that by 1899, when Mr. Merriam and his work was being conducted, he notes that during the past 10 years, the country about Shasta, particularly on the west and south, has been repeatedly devastated by forest fires. Here is elsewhere, lumbermen and fires have destroyed the greater part of the timber on the lower slopes and adjacent plain. So although we talk about reference conditions, it's probably important to note that between Native American fire use and the entry of the railroads, it would be pretty hard to pin down exactly what we want to think of as our reference vegetation condition. We know it's been modified a lot over time. And then, of course, here we are, 1905, The lands that were reserved public domain at the time were created into the National Forest Reserve, and the Shasta National Forest was established. A lot of vegetation manipulation, a lot of land change by the time the Forest Service actually enters the scene. And following railroads, we all know what comes next, lumber companies, because they had a lot of land. And two good examples of lumber companies in the watershed I'm talking about would be the Weed Lumber Mill, established in 1900 following the entry of the railroad. Mr. Weed purchased 280 acres and the Siskiyou Lumber and Mercantile, and voila, the town of Weed is born. Over on the McLeod side, of course, Mr. Van Arsdale and Mr. Scott were creating the McLeod River Lumber Company, also then generating the McLeod River Railroad about the same time, both notably before the establishment of the Shasta National Forest Reserve. So, lumber companies come along. So there it is, the ownership map. My future work. So the green we're looking at here is national forest, and you can see a lot of consolidation has already happened in the upper slopes within the wilderness area and in areas around the town of Mount Shasta and up towards the north end of the watershed. The tan here is timber companies, and a lot of that is the, obviously, railroad land grant lands that became timber company lands, and still quite a lot of it within the watershed. And the white, of course, is other private. That includes Sierra Club Foundation there is a great example. But a lot of agricultural lands, some of the municipalities are in the white ownership, residential uses, some of the other 40% of that private land that's in the watershed. I think, you know, as I have been sitting here with the Watershed Analysis over the past year and really absorbing some of the discussion from Steve and some of the other specialists, really noting that ownership and road systems, particularly, and Steve's got a great slide coming up here that I hope you'll pay attention to, the road system, is very much in a grid pattern. Our ownership, our road system roads follow ownership. So when we talk about road density, one of the things that drives that is all of those individual private ownership squares. All those folks want road access to those properties. So you end up with a road system that doesn't necessarily lay very elegantly across your landscape. If you think about a vegetation pattern, it's really this concentric circle that's on the map on the wall. And then if you think about your geologic and hydrologic, it's this really radial pattern. So three different key elements within the watershed with three completely different patterns going on. And I think at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
So we're moving over into chapter 5, and this is where we begin to just basically put everything together. This is called the interpretation section. And this is where we kind of revisit chapter 2, look at some of the issues we identified, look at the information we've assembled in chapters 3 and 4, and try to basically ask what it means and see if it sends us in a direction that really preps us for chapter 6, which is our management opportunities. One of the issues that we identified in chapter 2 was public use management, and I'm going to just illustrate how chapter 5 works with just one short example, and definitely encourage you all to check out the website, because chapter 5 does have a tremendous amount of information in it. We just will only focus on one example here. So for public use management, one of the things that the Forest Service has to do is manage a bunch of different land allocations, wilderness being the most obvious. On the summit of Mount Shasta is a specific land allocation that has a very specific management plan associated with it. But another one is what we call riparian reserves. And riparian reserves are basically, you can lump all hydrologic features into that category. They include your streams, your springs, your wet meadows. They even include unstable areas as well. And they also have a special allocation in a way that they are managed. And in theory, we're supposed to know where these are. And one of the things we discovered as we moved into this analysis is we really didn't. And part of that has to do with the fact that, again, Mount Shasta is actively eroding, and it's eroding so rapidly that it has a very dense channel network that is developed on it. However, if you're a backpacker and you look at this map, you'd be inclined to maybe bring one canteen of water. Pick up your water almost anywhere up there, and you quickly find out that there isn't a lot of water up there, particularly in late summer. And so in chapter 5, we identified this issue. It was kind of a tangential thing that came out of the analysis. And the present condition for the status of our knowledge of riparian reserves is that we don't really have a great feel for where everything is. We know where the obvious stuff is, your ash creeks and your mud creeks. But a lot of these other channels shown here really haven't been ground verified because the Forest Service doesn't really do a lot of active management, of course, on the upper slopes of Mount Shasta. Just to show several examples of what I'm talking about, up in the upper left corner we have Ash Creek Falls, a classic location and of course a perennial stream riparian reserve. The other 3 sites are much more suspect. Over on the upper right we have a channel that is mapped as a blue line stream by the USGS according to the quad maps, and yet when you get out there, it's on the north side of the mountain. It may have been created during a volcanic eruption or some sort of large melt event, but it doesn't appear to have held water in hundreds of years. On the lower right, we have another blue line stream, but in a closer inspection when we got out there, we discovered this was a swale with a road in it. And the road itself is so compacted you will actually see a trickle of water on it. But that's about the only sign of riparian features. There's no riparian vegetation or other attributes associated with many of those types of channels. And a really extreme example here, this is a riparian reserve on the left. This is Highway 97 buried by Whitney Creek. Well, across Highway 87. However, the channel here moved over half a mile during that flow. So once again, this challenge that mapping features poses on Mount Shasta, where the channels don't stay in the same place. It's a very dynamic environment out there. So, before I forget, this is a slide that shows all of the channels, potential channels in Mount Shasta, but also note the gridded road network that Stacy alluded to earlier. It also shows all the roads. Chapter 5 looks at trends for the state of our knowledge, and one of the trends that we are seeing is we have better technology that's going to improve our ability to map hydrologic features on the mountain. And one of those tools that we're using is called LiDAR technology, which is basically just very high-resolution satellite imagery that can map elevations to centimeters of accuracy on the ground. So the USGS actually paid for LiDAR imagery of Mount Shasta about maybe a year and a half ago, and this is the first LiDAR coverage we've had. And from that, the ground and the topography is so sensitive, you can actually model where the channels might be. And this slide, more than any other, illustrates how actively the erosion processes on Mount Shasta are working. It looks as if there's a channel everywhere. They're shown here in green. The perennial channels, or at least what we think are perennial, are shown in blue. But a lot of those channels were probably created again during episodic events. And Mount Shasta just continues to erode, and these features are going to be fairly frequently created and basically recreated over time during future large debris flow events and possibly volcanic activity. You'll notice right away too the road system doesn't seem to really acknowledge, as Stacy said, the radial pattern of these channels. The road system is very much laid out in a grid in many areas, and that is one of the reasons we have identified this issue of infrastructure and the need to kind of marry these two things together to figure out how we can better manage roads on the bottom. And so last but not least, chapter 6 is the opportunity section of a watershed analysis, and this is where we again put it all together and we try to look ahead. And it's been mentioned several times that watershed analyses aren't decision documents, but they do in some cases maybe set a tone for where we might want to go in the future. And we're going to just illustrate several of the conclusions that came out of this analysis and recommendations. And again, focusing on the issue of roads and disturbance processes and infrastructure effects. We think we can do a lot better job with our road systems out there. As we gain more knowledge about how disturbance activity works on the mountain, we're learning where we've not done a good job aligning and laying out our roads. This example here, this is the road to Brewer Creek Trailhead following a 2003 summer storm where the creek decided that it would be rather than its channel. We think we can do a much better job locating roads, designing roads so they're more compatible with at least smaller scale disturbance events that occur relatively frequently. And just another good example of another thing we can do much better, I think, is our stream crossings. Channels on Mount Shasta are really not well suited for culverts in many cases. So if you have a lower standard road, such as the 31 road shown here, in the 2003 storm, we lost every single pipe on that road. And yet most of those channels don't even flow. So you put the pipe in and you lose it when it rains. But and we think we can do a lot better here. We think we can actually possibly convert some of our lower standard roads into low water ford crossings, such as the one shown on the right. This is Ash Creek Crossing during that 2003 storm. You can see that the ford, well, it looks a little hazardous right now with the high flow. This ford works really well. Ash Creek moved a tremendous amount of boulders and material right over the 31 road, dropped it off the other side, and as soon as the event was over, it just took a little wind blade pass with a grader, and we were able to use that road again. So we want to look at opportunities where we can basically storm-proof these roads, make them a little more compatible with the disturbance out there, reduce our maintenance costs over time, provided that the access level on that road allows us to do that.
So other opportunities, Mount Shasta obviously extremely well loved and extremely well visited and extremely underdeveloped for facilities. So one of the things we'd like to look at is there an opportunity to look at some additional campgrounds, expansion of some campgrounds, relocation? Is dispersed camping appropriate, and if it is appropriate, where? How could you accommodate overnight use on the mountain, not only along the Everett Memorial Highway, but some of the other popular locations around the margins as well? Trails. I love hiking on Mount Shasta. I hope all of you do too. We'd like to have a little bit less of this. We'd like to have better trail systems that are pretty durable, that don't create resource impacts, but still get people to the places they really want to be and enjoy. So look at some possibilities, and not only just hiking trails, but the mountain bike trails. The Gateway Trail was a pretty popular new addition, and good to see people using it. Snowmobile trails, connecting trails. You know, we have resources on the mountains, the ski park, the Nordic Center, some of the other facilities and communities that border that watershed, in which people would love to be able to walk out the back door of the community and head off onto some small or longer connecting trails to get out and enjoy it. And one of the ones I like is thinking about reestablishment of the historic John Muir Trail, the old system trail. So just two examples of some of the opportunities that came out of a discussion looking at human use on the mountain. I'll hand it over, unless we do.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, yeah. So we have some data, and you saw some of those slides that have those charts, but there is a lot we don't know. And this summer, Jennifer started showing up on the mountain and started to ask people some questions about where they were from, why they were here. I think there is a lot of opportunity to do a whole lot more of that. I think the traffic counter data is great. It's pretty eye-opening. Obviously, all the Summit Pass data is great, but more data would be very helpful in trying to move forward from the left side planning into the right side NEPA and some of these actual project developments. So some opportunities here. And then where do we go from here? So, gosh, in the human use piece, obviously we know we have concerns with concentrated use. It'd be great if we knew a little bit more about the actual capacity. Is it 100,000 at Everett Memorial? Maybe it's 200,000. Maybe it's only 60,000. What do you really want to design for your maximum amount of use of those sites? Are there opportunities for new development? Interpretation education, those are great. We do have the small interpretive trail up there near Ski Bowl that talks about some of the avalanche. More of that would be terrific. Also some protective measures, forest orders. That's great. Wildland urban interface, we talked about that a little bit. We have a high density population. We are estimating roughly 15,000 people living in this watershed. So a lot of urban and a lot of urban interface with a lot of infrastructure at risk with our fires, recent fire suppression over the past history. And then historic properties. The mountain is a pretty important property, not only for Native Americans, but it is a wilderness area. It is a national landmark. It'd be great to spend a little time doing a little more discussion and display of that. So I think that is where we go from here. So where can you find this? Well, it's on our website, on the Forest Service website. So feel free to find your way in there and take a look. We are, again, saying it's a living document, so how can you help? You can help us with additional input. You can provide comments on the document. You can provide additional information. If you have more historic reference information, that's also useful. We welcome some feedback on this first effort at the Mount Shasta Watershed Assessment. And I believe that's it for tonight. Thank you very much, and we'd love to hear your
Wow, thank you guys so much for distilling that many, many pages into a very digestible and clear presentation. That was really well done. And I'm sure that many of you now, after hearing that, may have more detailed questions that you'd like to ask this panel of people. So I'll just try and, if you keep your hands, then I'll be able to call on you. So this gentleman here, and then you, and then in the back. Okay, we'll start there.
Where is the lava inside of the mountain? At what elevation, at what volume? Does anybody know?
I don't believe we do. You know, I'll take down some of these questions, maybe even take your name and get back to you, but we have the exterior of the Mount Shasta map. I know the USGS has done a tremendous amount of work on the lithology, mapping the lavas as they appear on the surface. I know they've done a lot of dating as to the eruptive activity, so they have some idea of when the eruptions occurred and how the mountain was built and how the cones were built. But as far as to, you know, do they really know exactly where it is in the interior? I couldn't say.
Your email address?
I can provide that for you. Yes, it's S. Bachmann, so it's SBACHMANN at fs.fed.us. FED is in fed.us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's not Michelle.
Next to you. Yeah, you.
This is probably to Steve again. How was the delineation of the watershed determined? And let me tell you my observation. I saw that Ash Creek Butte was in, but Whaleback wasn't. So I'm assuming that's a Klamath versus Shasta Trinity thing. But on the other hand, I saw that Shastina Lake was in, but the top of Black Butte, half of Black Butte and Spring Hill weren't included, which seemed like a natural to me, and none of Kaiser Meadows or Mills Meadows and any of that whole system, which seems like that's part of the watershed.
I can explain that probably.
And it goes down and grabs a golf course and goes back to the mountain.
The lower boundary is fairly arbitrary, I guess is the answer to that question, because of course we don't have a topographic boundary to end that. So the boundary of the ecosystem analysis is essentially based on the boundaries that we used for all of the other earlier watershed analyses that were completed. So for example, the Kaiser Meadows area was analyzed previously in an earlier watershed analysis for the, I believe, the headwaters of the Sacramento River or the Shasta River watershed analysis. So we have several different watershed coverages that we've used over the last 15 years, and we've been working through these analyses over time. And so when we finally got to this one, this was literally the last one, we looked at what hadn't been covered, what had been covered, and we preferentially set the boundary to make sure we captured all the federal lands that hadn't been addressed in earlier analyses. In some cases, we rolled lands in that were addressed in other analyses, but in the cases we moved further to the east, like out towards Shastina, we were getting so far away and off the forest over to the Klamath that we chose just to basically tighten the boundary so it meshed in that case with the Shasta River watershed with Parks Creek and South Fork Willow Creek in that area. So I guess to answer the question, it's fairly arbitrary on the lower end, but then to fill in the gaps.
Back there and then up here.
So, I belong to several groups and we're very concerned with the purity of our groundwater and spring water, particularly in the vicinity of Mount Shasta City and McLeod City, and particularly in regard to the Roseburg section that we all know about, and the potential for pollution of our groundwater. I'd like to see more action and observation given to the purity of groundwater and drinking water city wells for those two communities in your analysis. And would you please comment on the Roseburg section and various proposals and what you're going to do with the sewage and miscellaneous industrial cleaners that are going down the drains in ski areas? And will that get to Mount Shasta and McLeod eventually? Some of these compounds that are going down the drain up to the ski area?
Boy, you know, the latter part I couldn't really answer, to be honest with you, but I guess to comment on the Roseburg site, we definitely didn't get into that kind of detail in this watershed analysis, partly because we were focused more on the public lands higher up in the watershed. I actually live right below the Roseburg site, so I'm always very interested in the water quality that's coming out of my well, but I really can't speak to that. I do know that, you know, studies were underway, and perhaps some people in this room may have more information on that than me. But of course, we're always concerned with, you know, the potential for contamination of our water. I will say that the hydrology of Mount Shasta, again, is so complex. They've looked for contaminants, for example, over in McLeod before, using dye tracer studies, and dumped tremendous amounts of tracer dyes into the aquifers up there at the old mill site, and none of it has ever showed up in subsequent samples. So we have a very complex hydrology, particularly as it relates to what's under the ground, that we need to increase our understanding of. And that theme's actually been echoed on several other projects we've been working on as a community with multiple stakeholders. So I guess to wrap that answer up, we have a long way to go, but it is a data need.
So let us be very careful. I like clean water.
Steve, I had a question on the pyroclastic flow up on the northwest quadrant of that slide. There was a bunch of horizontal lines heading toward weed, so sort of a subsector of that. What is that indicative of?
I have to look at the slide.
Probably about the fourth slide.
While we're waiting, is this presentation available in print or online?
Not yet. It probably could be.
Yeah, on the western quadrant, northwestern quadrant, there's always one subsector.
Yeah, so for the pyroclastic flows, that area is coded in the legend, if we're referring to the dot grid area, is an area that's unlikely to be directly affected by future pyroclastic flow activity. I can't, to be honest with you, answer that question as to why that would be, but maybe we have so much expertise in the room. Turn it over to Bill.
This was based on a study that was done years ago by the USGS, and what they assumed was the eruption would occur at or near the summit, the modern summit. And pyroclastic flows are density driven, and so with Shastina sitting there as a high point, the thought was if the eruption did occur at the summit, the flows would split around Shastina, sort of Shastina would cast a shadow to the west. But you know, if you look at where eruptions have occurred on the mountain, the vent could open almost anywhere. So that's more of an artifact of the model that they created.
Thanks, Bill.
It's probably a question for Stacy on, I noticed the public use numbers, both the permit number, both the wilderness permit and the backcountry permit numbers seem to peak in 2000, 2001. And I was wondering if you think that's a true number or whether that's an artifact of some changes in the way that use is being measured and monitored.
I don't know. I know that we have had peaks of use, and I know that recently it's plateaued off a little bit for both numbers. You know, I know, I'll say this knowing that it may be completely not true, but I know at one point when the book came out, John Krakauer about Everest, that we saw a little peak in people that wanted to run up Mount Shasta and also experience a fabulous, life-threatening experience. So that may be it. I know things like, and this doesn't go back that far, but I have been told that the 1987 harmonic convergence also created a spike in visitation here, and possibly some of the direct impacts into Camper Meadows and to Southgate Meadows that we're seeing were a result of people coming here for one event, but then discovering Mount Shasta and deciding, oh my goodness, I just need to put this on the list more often. So.
I think this is for Stacy. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you mentioned when the railroad land grants turned into timber lands.
Yeah, so 1866 Federal Act to grant lands every other square mile for 10 miles either side of the railroad line to those railroad companies. And the goal of the land grants were to generate revenue. So the railroads would have cash to build railroads, generally a subsidy. Well, for the railroads, that was great, but they were really in the railroad business. So a lot of that spun off into timberlands. So a lot of the original railroad companies were the originators of some of the larger now timber companies that hold those properties. And have changed hands a lot over time, but that is the origin of that land use pattern, was originally to those. And in our area, it started out, first it was the Central Pacific Railroad in the 1880s. And then soon after that, and I'm not sure on the date, it became Southern Pacific Railroad. So, does that help?
Yeah, I was just curious about that link. And then also I was wondering about the plantations. Are those primarily on public or private lands? And is there anything being done to alleviate the disease and fire concerns from the monotypic plantations?
I actually have the percentage that's on private versus federal. So 16% of the entire plantation area is on private ownership, so that's about 3,100 acres. And what was the other part of your question?
Oh, you mentioned some of the disease and fire concerns associated with the monotypic plantations, and I'm curious if there's any effort to diversify the reforestation efforts, or just how that plays in as your knowledge develops.
Yeah, we are actively managing those plantations and trying to do thinnings, create openings in some areas. They don't have a lot of diversity to begin with, so adding that in is something that we're looking at. A lot of these areas are close to the wildland-urban interface, so it's a priority area for us to do treatments out there. And so over the past couple of years, off the Everett Memorial, you'll see that we've been thinning in those plantations. We also have timber sales. It was the mountain thin. Those kind of things we targeted. So we are actively looking at those areas.
And I'm fairly sure monotypic is a thing of the past for plantations now. They're pretty mixed conifer. I will say, I don't think we're going to reattempt the sequoia.
Is that true for private as well?
I believe so, yeah. I think just as a survival tactic, monotypic isn't great.
Yeah.
A couple years back, I heard a rumor about private well usage monitoring. Has any of that brought up, and do you ever intend to do something like that?
I guess I can take that question. It hasn't been brought up in regards to any work that the Forest Service is proposing. I have heard the need to improve our knowledge on groundwater, and basically flow patterns, that it would be nice to do some monitoring on wells. But once again, I don't believe that there's ever been a plan put forward directly to do that at this time. But yeah, it is a very acknowledged data gap right now in our understanding of how the water table behaves in portions of the Mount Shasta aquifer.
Hope it never happens.
Yep.
Is the State Water Resources Control Board involved in any of this?
Not directly, no. We do, no, actually, I would just have to say no. This was more of an internal document, and we are rolling it out, and really we're directed to involve stakeholders and the public in preparation of these documents. So this is really our first attempt to do that. Now that we have something kind of in place for people to look at, we're hoping to roll one back in. And certainly other groups and stakeholders, resource agencies, would be potential candidates to provide more input into this analysis.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, do you have a follow-up? Because mine's on a kind of a different.
No, it's actually slightly different. Go ahead.
Okay. Just curious, when you're talking about multi-use and connecting, say, out to the ski park or the Nordic Center, any thoughts around a rails to trails usage of the spur that comes down now through Mount Shasta? Is there? It's privately owned right now, but would you guys have the wherewithal to help switch that over if it became available? If you're talking about multi-use and.
So yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I know about the railroad system, the McLeod Railway, previously McLeod River Railroad. On the McLeod side of the world, what is now the Great Shasta Rail Trail project, about, I would say, roughly 14 miles of that stretch is actually on cross-national forest system lands, and it has been permitted. So as a land manager, we're participatory in that process with that group. For this side, it's a very small footprint, actually. There's just a little tiny piece of National Forest System lands right at the Ski Park Highway, where the railroad left its deeded access to straighten out a curve, and then there's a very small piece that is actually just fill material in Big Canyon that sits on National Forest. So as an agency, we have a much smaller footprint for the railroad on this side of the hill. That said, I think certainly, as an agency in the recreation business, we're always willing to be at least at the table, as we are with the other side. And you're right, currently it's private owned, and that is not, as far as I know, on the table as a trail.
Not yet.
And your follow-up question?
Actually, was not a follow-up question. Carolyn, you kind of went out of your way to emphasize that no decision would be made from this document on the basis of this document. What about recommendations?
Right, and that's kind of what we were doing with the opportunities section. Chapter 6 kind of identifies different opportunities. We only went through a few. There are a lot of things that we can do, but really one of the things I wanted to do the document with the group was to, we always have so many questions that come up about the area, and it helped me put in context where should our priorities be. So like you heard today, the concern about concentrated use. And we're trying to move forward on some of those areas as, Jen's gathering more data. We're concerned about the condition of our meadows, wanting better trails. Some of these things we're going to start moving forward on. We have to weigh with all our other projects, but we definitely we see that imbalance between what the situation is now, even with what Angelina was asking about the plantations. So every time we have information that we could fold into a new NEPA document, we will. So I think what I'll get to the point is that what you'll see this year is I think there might be some trail restoration projects, like up to Southgate Meadows. We've talked about that. Panther Meadows, doing some, we found there's some data gaps that Stacy mentioned. We're going to start collecting more information on those. Those are a couple of the things that we're going to start moving forward with this year.
By the way, Stacy, for your historical information, they've got a lot of old photos around here, especially on the west side of the mountain. And if you know Bob Gray, it's Bob here.
It was a little frustrating as we were finally pulling together the slideshow for tonight. We were locating a lot of great photos that did not make it into the original document. So hopefully there's some opportunity to go back and make that a lot more interesting and robust.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was wondering, to kind of follow up with what you were saying, you said this year you're going to start working on some implementation of some of your, wouldn't it be nice to? I was wondering, you know, in this age of budget constraints, kind of give a time frame or kind of a plan on how you're going to fill some big gaps, start addressing road conditions and so on. Do you have kind of more specific framework given, like I said, budget constraints and priorities?
So I know for the